Donald Trump is looming so large in the Canadian consciousness right now. I have seen a lot of my compatriots, running around like chickens with their heads cut off saying, oh my God, Donald Trump is a madman. You can't understand what he's doing. There's no rhyme or reason to it. I looked at what Donald Trump was doing and I thought, okay, I don't have to like it. But if the question is, can I understand it? The answer is yes.
Brian Lee Crowley is the founder and managing director of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, a major Canadian think tank whose work is often cited by the Canadian Parliament.
What exactly is the difference between Canada and America? It's not that it's difficult to answer because there aren't differences. It's difficult to answer because the differences are subtle and hard to express.
In this episode, we dive into the recent election in Canada, Trump's comments about Canada as America's 51st state, and what the future of U.S.-Canada relations may look like.
Canada exports 50% of everything made in the private sector, and the vast bulk of that, like 90%, goes to the United States. By contrast, foreign trade or international trade only represents barely 25% of the American economy. So while for Canada, the relationship with the United States is existential, for America, the relationship with Canada is convenient, nice, not existential.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kelly. Brian Lee Crowley, such a pleasure to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Yeah, and thanks so much for having me.
I suppose I should call it Canadian Thought Leaders.
Well, that'd be a good choice.
But so what happened with the Canadian election, and what did U.S. President Donald Trump have to do with it?
Very interesting question, Jan. Several things happened to change politics in Canada quite radically in a very short time. One was that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who had become deeply unpopular, suddenly left. He was basically forced out by his party. Second, Donald Trump came to power in Washington. And as a result of these changes, the assumption everybody had made that Pierre Poilievre and the Conservative Party were going to waltz into power sort of unopposed suddenly came crashing down, partly because there was now a new leader of the Liberal Party. He had a completely different profile than Justin Trudeau. Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of Canada, governor of the Bank of England, someone who seemed to be, to a lot of people, a calm, competent, technocratic kind of leader. And that seemed to, I think, a number of Canadians, the perfect response to Donald Trump, who started talking about Canada's the 51st state and how happy America would be to annex Canada. And so, and this makes Canadians deeply nervous. One of the important reasons why Canada exists as a country is because at several points in our history, we kind of asked ourselves, do we want to be Americans? And the answer was no, we want to, we're a New World country. We share many characteristics with America, but we're not Americans. We want to have our own model of a New World society that's different from Europe, different from the old countries, but that has the same, values, freedom and enterprise and all those other things just as much as America does, but comes to different conclusions about the role of government, the pursuit of the common good, et cetera, et cetera. So in that context, Donald Trump's musings about making Canada the 51st state and so on, and how Canada has nothing constructive, useful to offer the United States, made many Canadians deeply anxious. And I think Mark Carney stepped into that situation and said, I'm the guy who can represent Canada in an effective way vis-a-vis Donald Trump. And Canadians, not in large numbers, but enough Canadians accepted that argument that he just squeaked past the Conservatives, 43% of the popular vote for the Liberals, almost 42% for the Conservatives, not much in the difference, but enough to win enough seats to form a government.
For a while, it seemed like it was almost based on the polling, right? It seemed like it would almost be a blowout for the Liberals. But then that shifted too, and I find that really interesting. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yes. So I think the early stages of the campaign, Donald Trump, I think, drove the anxiety levels of Canadians who cared about these issues to unprecedented heights. And the issues that had previously been the ones that we thought were going to dominate in the election campaign in Canada, cost of living, efficiency of government, and so on, levels of taxation, these things started to come back to the fore. Ultimately, what happened was the Liberals went from being just streets ahead in the polls to almost level pegging with the Conservatives. And it was in that state of public opinion that the voting actually happened.
I've spent the last however many months explaining to Americans in Washington, D.C., that Canadians have this kind of oppositional identity. And I think what you said kind of explains it a little bit. Like there's an element of the Canadian identity which is clearly, I am not American. And I remember that growing up in Canada as well. It was very distinctive and very important, actually. And later, only later did I realize that that seemed odd to have an oppositional identity. But that, you know, Prime Minister Trudeau famously described Canada as a post-national state. But I wonder, I guess seeing what we saw, I guess that kind of proves that it's not, because whatever those embers of Canadian nationalism that existed still, they came roaring back in the last few months, right? Even if it is this kind of oppositional identity.
It's a very difficult question to answer. What exactly is the difference between Canada and America, or Canadians and Americans? And that's it. It's not that it's difficult to answer because there aren't differences. It's difficult to answer because the differences are subtle and hard to express. I always like to go back to the difference between the founding documents of Canada and the United States. In the United States, you have a society in which, in this wonderful, immortal phrase, people are free to pursue life, liberty, and happiness. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those were not the values that we chose to highlight when we wrote down in our Constitution what it was that we were about. We chose to talk instead about peace, order, and good government. And you see, I think those phrases actually summarize in a shorthand way some slightly different angles on, you know, what's the purpose of government? How do people fit into a larger society? What are we trying to do together? Remember that America broke away through a violent revolution from the Crown and the United Kingdom, from Great Britain. Canadians never experienced that. In fact, people often talk about the 13 colonies, forgetting that there were actually 16 colonies, 13 of whom rebelled and 3 of whom remained loyal to the Crown. So even back at the time of the Revolution, there were parts of what became Canada who said, yeah, that's not the route we want to go. We tend to be people who believe more in the quiet, thoughtful evolution of institutions rather than liking this idea of, oh, you know, if you don't like what you got now, a radical break, start again, reinvent. That seems to us a very American way of thinking about things. I don't say that in a critical way. I'm a great admirer of America. But Canada has chosen an evolutionary path in which we put a little more emphasis on the idea of the common good, a little less emphasis on the idea of individual liberty as the be-all and end-all. We're great believers in individual freedom. But we don't think that individual freedom is the entire answer to the purpose of Canada. We think individual freedom in the context of an ordered society that believes that we collectively can do things together that individually we would find difficult. from the outside, those differences don't appear very great. You know, Europeans come to Canada and they say, why are you so fussed about not being thought Americans? But from the inside, the differences to us are quite obvious. And without in any way feeling that it means that we're superior to America, it does make us feel that we've chosen a slightly different path in North America. And it's one, you know, that our ancestors fought and suffered and paid for, and that we have inherited, and it's ours. And that matters to us.
Brian, one quick sec, we're going to take a break, and folks, we'll be right back. And we're back with the founder and managing director of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute in Canada. In some of your recent writings, you've gone to great pains to try to explain, I guess, the way of thinking or the approach of US President Trump and the Trump administration. And I thought, you know, reading this, I thought to myself, I think you understand it better than probably a lot of Americans. Not, you know, obviously not a majority of Americans, but some. And maybe I wanted you to kind of reprise that for me a little bit here.
One of the reasons I've been thinking about this is because, precisely because Donald Trump is looming so large in the Canadian consciousness right now. And I have seen a lot of my compatriots, you know, running around like chickens with their heads cut off saying, oh my God, Donald Trump is a madman. You can't understand what he's doing. There's no rhyme or reason to it. And I looked at what Donald Trump was doing and I thought, okay, I don't have to like it. That's a separate question. But if the question is, can I understand it? The answer is yes. There were three sort of major themes that kind of leapt out at me. One is that Donald Trump believes in his guts that America is the top nation in the world. It's the most important country. It's the one that sets the stage for almost every other important relationship, alliance, you know, trading relationship, and so. And he feels that America has gone through a period of decline, has lost some of that top nation status. It's being challenged by some other countries. And I believe that he sees it as his role as president to restore America to this top nation status. Now, I mentioned that, so that's number one. I mentioned that there are countries that are challenging America in this top nation status. And of course, the one that comes immediately to mind is China. And I believe that Donald Trump has in the back of his mind in almost every issue that he wrestles with, whether it's trade or defense or national security or even the drug trade, fentanyl, et cetera, he has in the back of his mind, China is our great rival, China is our competitor, and China is using many of these issues that America must wrestle with as sticks to beat America with. I mentioned the drug trade. I think it's a beautiful example of that. Clearly, China has a political strategy behind its trading relationship with the United States in a way that you know, most other Western countries would not. They don't mix trade and politics the way that China does. And so, given his preoccupation with returning America to the top nation status, to removing any ambiguity about that, and to his sense that top nation status must mean a muscular response to China. The third thing I add to that is that Trump believes that as America has failed to live up to its responsibilities to be top nation, there are certain parts of American society that have suffered as a result. And The kind of people we're talking about, of course, are the ones who were immortalized in J.D. Vance's book, Hillbilly Elegy, the kind of people he grew up with, the communities that he knew, sometimes referred to as the Rust Belt or the flyover states, or however you like to think about it. I believe that Donald Trump thinks that these people who form, I think, the bedrock of his political support are people who have been forgotten and left behind by an America abandoning its vocation to be top nation, refusing to stand up to China, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And Donald Trump wants to be the tribune of these people. He wants to be their champion. Think about a very famous phrase widely associated with Donald Trump: drill, baby, drill, okay? People think that this is just, Trump in one of his macho moods saying, I'm going to preside over a huge expansion of the oil and gas industry and so on. It's much more than that. You see, I think Trump has come to understand the extent to which energy, and particularly oil and gas, are tremendously powerful tools. And back to this theme of restoring America's greatness, returning it to top nation status, he would look back at the 1970s, for example, when America went through two oil crises, one caused by OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, putting an embargo on exports to the United States, which caused, I remember it well, it caused huge queues around gas stations. States brought in 50-mile-an-hour speed limits in order to make people drive slower and use less gas. And then there was the Iranian Revolution, which again, later in the 70s, terribly disrupted the world oil supply and caused another energy crisis in the United States. And you might recall that as a result, America had rules about, you couldn't export oil from the United States. America was very dependent on oil from the Middle East in particular. And this was a source of great weakness for the United States. And Donald Trump then sees how, the fracking revolution, the huge increase in the amount of oil being produced by the United States, and America's transformation from a net oil consumer to a net oil exporter. In fact, the largest exporter in the world, bigger than anybody else, has fundamentally changed the American economy, American national security, and he wants to push that even further. And he thinks that drill, baby, drill is in part an industrial strategy. It's the idea that America should double down on its incredible technological prowess and its ability to produce vast quantities of energy in a cost-effective way, and not only improve America's national security, but unlock a lot of economic activity that requires access to cheap, reliable energy. So I think all of these things actually he's woven them together in a strategy for America. And again, agree, disagree. If you want to understand anything that Donald Trump does, I think if you refer back to these four things: top nation, challenge of China, recovering the promise of America for the people who were left behind, and cheap, plentiful energy as the bedrock of an American economic renaissance, you will understand almost everything that Donald Trump does. Why is it lost on so many people? See, I think it's because people get distracted by Donald Trump's tactics and they forget to think about strategy. Donald Trump is the inheritor of a great tradition, a great American tradition of showman. He's a kind of a Barnum and Bailey figure, isn't he? And part of what he wants to do, and this goes right back to The Art of the Deal, You know, I've often believed if people tell you who they are, you should believe them. And I think Donald Trump has been quite open about who he is. Donald Trump conceives himself as a great deal maker. You know, all of the things that I've described, you know, the relationship with China, the energy renaissance, America's top nation, restoring its trading dominance, all of these things, he sees them all as deals that he can strike. If you sort of inquire into Donald Trump's personality, his character, how he goes about making deals, one of the things that comes through crystal clear is he says, my starting point for any major negotiation is I convince the people I'm negotiating with that I am the craziest man in the room. If they don't do what I want them to do, I will bring everything crashing down. And people listen to him, they say, oh my God, he's going to tear everything down. He's a crazy man. I actually think what he's doing is he's saying, look up here at this shiny, frightening object I'm waving in your face, when he's actually busy doing something quite different.
As we finish up, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute is probably one of my favorite think tanks. I've, over the years, keep coming across reports coming out of it, speakers. I see it on people's resumes who I'm interested in, who I admire. Just very briefly, as we actually finish, just tell me a little bit about it.
Well, you know, I had a fancy job here in Ottawa a few years ago as the what's called the Clifford Clark visiting economist at the Ministry of Finance, and so that person is brought in from the outside as the sort of one man or one woman in-house economic policy think tank and gadfly for the entire federal government. It's quite an interesting position. And after I'd been in this job for 2 years, and it's a limited appointment, 2 years. So I was about to go home, and I said, well, what have I learned from my experience here? And answer number one, I learned that Ottawa is in a terrible mess. You know, spending out of control, programs that don't achieve anything, nobody in charge. And I said, okay, so, but what can I do about that? And it occurred to me that Ottawa was the only G7 capital that didn't have a national think tank in the capital talking about national policy issues to national policy makers, the national media, and the national electorate. I thought this was a huge hole in our democratic infrastructure. And I set out to fill it because I'm a think tanker. So,
well, Brian Lee Crowley, it's such a pleasure to have had you on.
All the pleasure was mine.
Thank you all for joining Brian Lee Crowley and me on this episode of American Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Yanya Kellick.